Welcome to Healthcare IT Today. I'm John Lynn, together with my colleague and friend Colin Hung. The world of technology and healthcare are ever changing in new and novel ways, and that's why we love this stuff. So join us as we discuss the latest healthcare and health IT news meshed together in new ways, which help generate ideas and new perspectives. Plus, we'll have a little fun along the way. Today, we're going to be talking about the recent Epic UGM Conference, Epic's user conference. And be sure to follow the show on social media at the hashtag HITSM and our personal accounts at TechGuy and at Colin_Hung. Plus, check out our 18 years of health IT content at healthcareittoday.com. So, how much FOMO did you really feel from all my pictures at Epic UGM, Colin?
Totally had FOMO because last year was the first time I ever got to go and first time ever to the UGM to the Epic campus. And I was totally jealous of the fact that you got to go this year, but fair that you got to go this year instead of me. So
I know it only took me like a decade or more of wanting to go and finally being able to go. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was a unique experience, that's for sure, which I think is their intent.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, so do you finally have experienced the tent, right, in the parking lot, which, it isn't really a tent. It I don't know what it is. It's sort of a temporary building, really. But,
I actually didn't go there. They didn't have anything for the press in the tent. I think it was mostly meals for the members. There it looked like there was a party going on the night that I ended up leaving, or some sort of dinner or something or other. But yeah, I actually didn't make it to the tent. Although when I looked at the map, there were like big cement area for a tent. It was like, I don't know, it was like some description that way. They're like, yeah, that cement block right there is just for our temporary tent, so we can do UGM. So yeah, the tent was a big part of it. But I think what's fascinating about it, when I think about the experience, was how invested they are when they roll out a new building and a new campus, if you will. I think they have like 5 buildings per campus and 350 people per building, very intentional in how they do it, all underground parking. So, which makes sense if you're in Wisconsin. That's a really nice gift to your employees that don't have to go out in the snow and scrape their car off, right? Like there's some things that just are really intentional. Some of it, to be fair, did feel a bit over the top. Like, does it really help creativity? I look at Zappos here in Vegas. They're over the top with what they do. They decorate their different sections. They have an open floor plan. So, unlike Epic, which has individual offices with a few people sharing just because they grow too quickly. But Zappos goes all in on that culture thing with when you're a call center, which is what the majority of Zappos employees are. That's fun because then you get to enjoy each other and celebrate each other. But the programmers that I worked at Zappos were like, dude, I hate it. Like it distracts me from my work and whatever, right? So I think there's some interesting things that as I heard one person say, well, it kind of just blends in over time. You just get used to it and you forget about it. And so is it worth the investment or not? Certainly Judy makes the case that it helps to foster creativity. It helps to in the recruitment. That is a big recruiting experience when you come there. The kitchens were massive. Of course, they brought in other vendors for us to eat from rather than their own cooks. Their own cooks were in the tent, I think, cooking for the other members. But anyway, it was interesting to see how they approached it all.
yeah, and I get it. I'm actually a fan of it, right? Mostly because I think Judy has very similar tastes in in science fiction. But I often wondered if it's just a case of this is what they needed to do at the beginning, right? Because if you imagine way back at the start, who would want to come to Verona, Wisconsin, and live, right? So you had to do something, and back then, back in the 70s and 80s, like, that was a thing. Like it was rare, very rare to have a non-button down corporate culture, right? And so I think it was really good. And so once you start, you can't sort of revert back, right? Like if you've kind of let like the first 500 employees kind of see that you're decorating your place like a castle, a medieval castle, then the next 500 people you're going to attract are like, wow, that's cool. I want to work in the castle. And you're like, well, then I can't build a glass steel office tower. I got to build another one and another. And so I wonder how much momentum that is because when people see it, they go, if they're bought in, they're probably okay with it. And if they're not bought in, they probably wouldn't have applied to go to Epic, right?
Yeah,
Um,
well, and from what I hear, the new buildings, there's a bit of cajoling between, employees who gets to go to the new building. They want to experience the new building, whatnot, which I think is interesting. But you're right. If they just built a nondescript building, who wants to work there versus the other? That's probably a problem now for them as well. I think that they do realize the optics are a little challenging, that you're spending all this money on different things when you're like, hey, that means the doctors are paying for it, which eventually the patients are paying for it, right? And so I think they understand that optics because there were a number of times in different experiences where they're like, yeah, it doesn't cost any more to have colorful carpet or to have different chairs that are unique in the various conference rooms. It's like, yeah, those don't cost extra. So I think they have heard some of that maybe. And so optically they're like, yeah, a lot of this doesn't cost a lot extra. Some of the art's doing it locally, so you're supporting the local, right? I mean, so it is an interesting balance for sure, when it comes to it, but it's an experience that you won't soon forget. I also loved and this is a low cost thing that's great for employee morale, I'm sure. I think it was the 10-year handprints. I don't know if you saw those
yeah.
all around the deep space, I believe it was. And so, at 10 years, you put your handprints in this kind of almost tile type thing. And you get, your name's going to be up there forever as someone that, was there for 10 years or more. So I think there's some cultural things like that are pretty cool as well.
So John, other than the experience, was there anything that you heard or saw at the Epic UGM in terms of getting an understanding where Epic may be going directionally?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting that in Judy's opening keynote, she reaffirmed things that she'd shared multiple times. And maybe it was just in her Judy's notes, I think is what it's called or whatever, where she tells stories about it. She took a lot of those Judy's notes and put those in the keynote. So those weren't really a surprise. They were stories that we'd heard about the underground parking or about the efforts to never go public or, different cultural things that really are quintessentially about them and about the culture that they've created. I do think Epic, interestingly enough, I've described Epic as the most customer focused company I've ever met. Like they will do whatever they need for their customer. That's been my experience. But when you hear, Epic start, when Judy's keynote, she says, we've been patient centered from day one, which is interesting because sometimes customer focus and patient centered can be at odds. And so you have to make tough decisions. And so I think that's one of those challenges. But to be frank, I think that's where they're headed is they want to do everything that they can for the customers to improve the customers' lives. If they hear that integration with some vendors that they are using is a problem, then Epic wants to build that for them so that that integration is done natively and it's no longer a problem for their customers. I mean, they're that customer focused. So directionally, I think it's all about the customers.
Yeah, and that's pretty consistent, right? Like through the years. I mean, people when they were adopting Epic, that's what drew them to it, right? And because the functionality you could argue was equivalent to whatever else was available at the market at that time. But it was Judy and her team's commitment to, okay, we will be here until it runs, right? We will be here, we will not leave until we fix this. Yeah, I mean, you can see that when you go to the user group conference, right? Not that it's over the top in terms of lavish food or whatever, but they do make sure that everyone's taken care of. They do make sure that you have a place to stay. Like they do everything to make sure that their customers are treated well. So
Yeah, it's
not
quite the
surprising to
opposite. I'd say
hear.
they're quite conservative in that regard. No alcohol, no,
Yeah.
yeah, you have what you need, but we're not going to waste money on it, which is a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but it's interesting to hear you say that they're continuing that focus, but adding in this little element of patient centered, like, because I think that's maybe a reflection of where their customers have to be, right? Their customers are talking about this now and having to be more patient centered and catering more to their customers, the patient. And so I think Epic may be slowly changing its tune a little bit to say we're also patient centered and, you
Mhm.
know, everything that they do is supposedly centered around the patient as well.
Yeah, and I think Judy would argue she's always been that way, which is interesting. Two other kind of directionally things that they're doing. One that you could see definitely, especially as they highlight the new customers, was
Mhm.
the international growth. So the
Mhm.
efforts to grow internationally and to adapt Epic internationally and make it work internationally, where it is a very different thing because the billing process is different and what they care about is different. You see that, and I think they're making a lot of wins internationally, and it will be interesting to see how that continues to play out. They even had a day dedicated to the international people at UGM at the end of UGM to be able to have some of those discussions. So I think that was a big effort on their part to be able to embrace them. Another one that I think was interesting was the payer effort, right? The payer
Mhm.
platform and being able to reach out to payers to bridge that gap to payers. No doubt that's something they're spending a lot of money, time, effort, energy on. So I think that's an interesting effort as well, as far as directionally where are they going, bridging the payers to the providers. I think, and maybe it's part of that whole trend of payvider, that they need to do, but they definitely have invested a lot of money in that direction.
Hey, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Healthcare IT Today with John Lynn and Colin Hung. Today, we're talking about the Epic UGM conference that John just recently attended. So, John, let's get into some juicy stuff. Based on what you saw there, are there any areas where you think Epic is going to disrupt?
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back to the age-old story that, a startup has. It's like, what if Google does this? Or in the healthcare world, it's what if Epic creates this? What will you do? Right? The VCs always ask a startup, and many times they're just like, well, they're not going to. They don't care. It's too small. They give all this, but it turns out it still is a viable thing that if Epic starts creating it, they become a competitor overnight, and they have certain things. So I wrote a bunch of them down, and a little bit of credit to Brendan Keeler. JD Whitlock pointed out a couple of them, and and saw some of these opportunities. I think payer platform's an interesting one, right? Where is that all going to go? And the payers are going to become a customer. Is that going to disrupt some of the payer side things? I'm not sure. I don't know that area as well, but it will be interesting to see. Aura, AURA, which it turns out there's a fun history from that, I guess. But anyways, the Aura is kind of their interoperability platform and sharing of data. But it definitely could be an LIS system. So because they have Aura for labs, and kind of compete in the lab space. They have Aura for medical devices that they're rolling out, starting with our friends at iRhythm. They
Mhm.
have the Zio platform, which does cardiac monitoring, and they're also going to work on the continuous glucose monitor. What does that mean? That's an interesting one. She kind of blew over this one. She mentioned, that hey, there's a problem with how we manage the different supplies that we have from surgical devices, and those are expensive. And why are we storing so many? And could we help with that? Because we know what all the surgeries are. Could we do something for that? So this whole surgical device manufacturer planning is an interesting space. She talked about a number of scheduling things. There's a number of companies working in the scheduling space that do this because it is such a problem. So, she talked about OR scheduling, nurse scheduling, staff scheduling. She's like, she was a little reticent with some of the provider ones, the clinician ones, because she's like, yeah, they hold that schedule sacred, right? Like they care a lot about that. So how do they want to do it? But, certainly they're looking at that spot. In the ambulatory space, there were a lot of, and even kind of edge ambulatory space, public health space, governmental healthcare spaces. They did a really interesting announcement with Washington State, where the state bought an instance of Epic that they can use across a wide variety of Indian health services and and governmental organizations that would use it. They also have the garden plot, which they'd announced previously, or I think it was orthopedics, and I just forgot the second one, but they announced two more that are coming, radiology and another one. So, which is essentially like, oh, you're an orthopedic ambulatory organization. You can't buy Epic on your own, but you could buy in a garden plot. So it's designed specifically for those industries. So kind of coming after the ambulatory EHR vendors. This one really hit me. And I think to me, it came out of the Change Healthcare ransomware incident, but that was they're looking at being a clearinghouse. Like, could they be a clearinghouse and disrupt some of the clearinghouses, or at least provide some redundancy clearinghouse wise? They have the power. They could go and build that. I think once they see the details of what's involved, it'll be interesting to see if they continue or not. I certainly felt that when they announced Payer Platform, they're like, we've done the work, and we feel, like in the way he said it, it was like, I feel the pain, right? Anyway, a couple more. This one you'll like, provider profiles, kind of in the Kairos space, and what they're doing. We'll see how that, rolls out and how that compares. And then another one, kind of in the Caregility space around virtual rounding, virtual sitting. It's kind of a different take, but it's embedded within Epic. They are working with some partners on it. So maybe Caregility becomes a partner. Anyway, those are some of the top ones. Just to overwhelm you.
No, that's quite the list, and I'm sure we're causing some angst now all of a sudden of our listeners who are maybe in some of these spaces. But I mean, but what everyone that you've mentioned, John, I mean, they all sort of make sense for Epic. Whether or not they choose to go there and down that path, or they might abandon it, because let's be honest, they've also abandoned a lot of spaces where they've tried something and then found out it didn't quite work for them, or they aren't the right company and they've backed off. So
Yeah, or they create a
they're
half-baked product that doesn't really compete with the other people.
exactly. So they may venture into the space, but there's no guarantee that they'll want to stay in that space. But there are some pretty interesting ones in here that I think are just a natural fit. Like the OR scheduling to me makes sense, right? Like why can't you do that and do that within the confines of Epic, right? It just
Question
seems
is,
like
why didn't
something.
you do that before?
Yeah, exactly. So that one to me makes sense. The one that doesn't make as much sense is the whole surgical device manufacturing planning, and as you get into more of the ERP side of running a hospital, clinical engineering, I'm like, not really. That's a bit of a stretch for me to run that inside of an EHR where you're holding patient data. I get maybe having a nice interface and so that one is a bit odd for me. The LIS is interesting. I mean, that's a whole new growth area, right? That's really, to me, that's more of a decision of is that a whole business that they want to get into? And maybe that's more international because I do understand that LISs are a bit more fragmented around the world than they are in the US. So maybe that's something they're learning as they go internationally. But the one that I think could be most interesting is the one you mentioned about the clearinghouse, right? Like given what's happened with change, and I think not only Epic, but I think a lot of other people are looking at, well, could we do this? But Epic has the power to go, well, if we did it, imagine how much savings it would be in terms of vendor management for hospitals, right? And for their customers. So that one very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back a little bit to the directionality question of Epic, but it was clear Judy still thinks that the best way to create software is as an integrated one. She highlighted not acquiring anyone again. And she, I think fundamentally believes that the best way to solve interoperability is for everyone to be on Epic, including the labs, including the pharma, including the med devices, including everything, right? Like, so fundamentally, if it's all on Epic, then you would think that would solve the problem. Although, you and I know we've talked to enough Epic organizations and enough patients that go to two Epic hospitals and they still can't share. Which that may be actually another theme as well, that I missed, was that Judy is pushing hard to get people to upgrade to the latest version and to use the software. So whether it's the Epic Gold Star, certifications, whether it's the level ups, whether it's the on-site visits, whether it's, they have a whole bunch of programs that they highlighted to say, we want to get you up to this and make sure that you're using it in a way that is powerful. So, I think that was another interesting trend. What's interesting too, though, is you look at it and say, okay, well, they're doing a lot and they do want to do a lot. There's a lot of people working to solve a bunch of these challenging problems and integrating the systems. But there's some areas that they won't disrupt. And to me, the one that actually stood out the most was ambient clinical voice, the AI ambient scribes, AI medical scribes. I talked to their director of innovation, Seth, I believe is his name, and it kind of said, hey, how do you decide when you build it yourself? They have 100 AI projects, right? We didn't even include the AI projects that they're going to disrupt, right? But they have 100 AI projects. How do you decide with ambient clinical voice you're really partnering, but in other cases, summarizing, you're going to do it yourself, or they certainly have a response for their messaging that's called ART, that's used to respond to messages and really to assist the doctor to generate the response quicker. They decided to do that themselves. It's like, how do you kind of decide? And he said, it's a mix of things, and it will evolve over time, for sure. But he said, it depends on the maturity of the implementations as well. And so, interestingly enough, that's maybe one thing to look at is, when it comes to health IT, how mature are the solutions that are out there versus, what they feel like they need to build. That's one way that you kind of look at, okay, well, they're not going to disrupt, at least for now, the ambient clinical voice area, because those solutions are more mature. And why should they build it again if there are a bunch of mature solutions out there? So that was another interesting thing to look at. It's like, okay, what aren't they going to do? That seemed like one area.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think they are smart enough to know that if there's a heavy incumbent or if there are already solutions out there that do the job very, very well, then they can always pick it up later, right? If and when the day it becomes a commodity, right? Or may never because there's not a lot of money in it. It's really more of a feature, right? So yeah, I'm not surprised. At first, I was surprised, honestly, that they weren't getting into it. But then when you saw the slew of announcements they have with the companies that they've decided to partner with on the AI side, Abridge and of course Nuance, we kind of like, okay, yeah, those are pretty established, pretty big organizations in terms of at least a presence in healthcare. So makes sense that you would partner with them rather than try and rebuild it yourself.
But that is the trend for Epic, right? Like, you work with a couple partners, figure out what the APIs are, the SDKs that are needed to integrate it, and then expand. So I think that's going to happen with medical devices. That's happening with ambient clinical voice. That is their approach. Let's start with a couple, build out what we need to, understand what the space needs and the integration that's needed, and then expand beyond that. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. There was another area too that I thought was interesting that was there and present, was our friends at Harmony Healthcare IT. And and the whole archiving and being able to archive old solutions, which I guess it kind of makes sense why Epic doesn't want to build that, put them at odds with the companies that they're replacing, and that they're kind of, that they still need that data, right? Their users need that data, but they want to archive it somewhere else. It makes sense why Epic isn't going to go there, but certainly that's another place that they're not going to disrupt. But had a lot of talk from CIOs who say, I need a solution where I can archive my data, because I do need to get rid of some of these systems.
So your final impression, John, of your UGM experience.
Yeah, so I'd say the most underrated part of a UGM, which I think a lot of Epic people don't maybe want to talk about or understand, but that was the 10 parties that I went to in Madison. You basically just went around downtown Madison by the, is it called Washington Square or whatever, the square in the middle, right, with the Capitol building. You just went to any bar, any restaurant during those days, and there was a party going on, amazing dueling pianos with some CIOs that coordinated it, so it wasn't even necessarily vendor focused for some of the parties, but you could just go to any of those and they were there, and you could have great conversations with vendors, with CIOs, with CMIOs, with the people implementing Epic. And that was probably the most underrated part. That was a lot of fun to go, and obviously it's a more informal environment and be able to talk with people. And for me, it was really amazing. I remember I went up to a couple of the CIOs and they're like, yeah, with healthcare IT today, they're like, oh, we know you, John. I had one as I was walking, and I was like, hey, and I felt like I knew him, but I couldn't place it or anything, but I didn't really know him. And he's like, yeah, John, we know you. We know healthcare IT today. We listen. So that was gratifying to hear as well.
Yeah, I think my one takeaway from last year event was just the reverence that people had for being there, and whether that was a customer, a partner, and it wasn't so much like, oh, I can't believe I'm here. It's just more like I'm really excited to be here, right? Like, and whether it was because of the campuses, whether it was just because to say that you got invited to the Epic UGM after years of trying to get in, or whether you're a user, and because there are so many users of Epic. Like you could choose from anybody in the hospital to go. So the fact that they all got chosen and then people were there, I found that sort of the most unique part of there, where everyone was just excited to be at this one particular user conference.
Yeah, and I'll have to throw real quick. We were able to go as press to a couple of user sessions, right? Where they were presenting. We could only go to a couple, but the ones I went to, I love it. Like it just reminds me why I love user conferences, because it's like the real nitty-gritty questions about how are you really implementing that? Give me the real deal. Don't give me the crap, BS. This is what you could do because they're living it. And so I love that, man. It was awesome.
Well, I'm glad we had the opportunity to go back. Hopefully we get invited back next year, but and we get to experience it all over again, John.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thanks to all of you who tuned into this episode of Healthcare IT Today. You can find out more details about our show by checking out the programs page on healthcarenowradio.com. And please share your voice and engage with the community at healthcareittoday.com and on social media using the hashtag HITSM. I'm Colin Hong along with my friend and Health IT collaborator, John Lin. Thanks for listening and have a great week.